Yes, there we go. All right, hello and welcome everyone. Um, Hopefully my audio is not screwing up again. All right. Um, so the first thing that I want to let you all know is that you will have a quiz this week. Um, it will be just like all the other ones. I think there's been two thus far, if I remember correctly, maybe three. Um, it's multiple choice, 5 questions. Can be on anything since the midterm. Um, so don't forget to take that. It's not worth that much of a grade, but it does give you a good idea of how well you've been paying attention. All right. So, um, any questions on that before we get launch into the lecture? Cool. Uh, Let me hit screen share. There we go. Ooh, that's not the right slide. There we go. So today we're talking about the Vietnam War. Um, not this is um quite a turning point in American history. Because since World War II, we've been talking about like times were generally getting better. But Vietnam is um this decade long conflict, actually kind of more than a decade, and we'll get to that. Um, that that ruptured American society, as we will see. uh, for the home front will be on Thursday. But this also transformed the way that like anti-communism was seen and that kind of stuff. You remember we talked about McCarthy and that, but the Vietnam War kind of made McCarthyism passe, to say the least, um, and it left a scar that we still feel today. Um, but generally, there's no real beginning to this. This is a war that's hard to pin down as to when it started or why. As we'll see with a lot of American conflicts from this point onward, they just seem to come out of nowhere. Um, so um, the the Vietnam War didn't start off as an American war. As we can see here, there were a series of fights between, well, first the French, and then the various splits in what they had called Indochina, but is now Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. So, um, up until the uh, the until 1954, um, Indochina was one place, and the upstart name um, Ho Chi Minh had been fighting the Japanese during World War II. He had and then declared independence in 1945. In fact, with some help by some OSS officers, as in the American early version of the CIA, that the thing during World War II. Um, and if you read their Declaration of Independence, it directly quotes the American Declaration of Independence, and it's probably because some OSS officers were helping him write it. um, so at first, the U.S. was actually kind of helping Ho Chi Minh until defeated uh, we defeated Germany, and Vichy France became regular France again and took up the fight to take back her colony. But Ho Chi Minh wasn't having it. Um, Also, during this period, Ho Chi Minh trended further and further to the left, um, becoming an avowed Marxist, and as concerns over communism and that's picked up in the 1940s, the U.S. quickly distanced ourselves from the from um, Ho Chi Minh's whole um, enterprise. But the Viet Minh, as they're called, the people who were fighting on behalf of this independent Vietnam, um, actually ended up beating the French. And with this defeat, they managed to carve out um, a what is this Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which is what it's still called, but only to the north. It was split right here, and the south was given to um, a Catholic um, president to run as a capitalist country. So you had kind of the same thing going here as with what happened in Korea. Also, the Cambodia and Laos were split off into their own republics, um, and quickly the North Vietnam supported um, guerrilla activities in South Vietnam, and that's what this final map is showing is all the different stuff. Unfortunately, I could only get it in a different language, but the but you can see all the different incidents, possibly more territory taken over, um, and just a huge amount of activity happening by the late 50s. Um, so the U.S. steadily got involved. People like to call this period the camel's nose, as in this Arab metaphor for um, a problem that steadily grows, um, also known as mission creep. Um, that your mission steadily grows bigger and bigger and bigger to the point that it becomes hard to keep a handle on. As the metaphor is that a camel will sometimes stick its nose under the tent, but if you let him do that, it will eventually topple the entire tent. Um, and that's pretty much what happened here. So the driving idea in terms of helping South Vietnam fight this guerrilla war um, was because there was this idea of the domino theory that essentially if we let South Vietnam fall, other countries will fall to communism. That it'll go from uh, from you know South Vietnam, then they take over Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, start taking over Indonesia down south, and eventually the start threatening Western Europe. After all, Vietnam was formerly a French colony. Um, so the this is why the U.S. steadily started giving support, even before the end of the Indochina War, which meant that which is what ended in 1954. Um, the um, U.S. was already sending in what were called military advisors, or MAG. Um, so the U.S. was involved in this initial war, but in a very small capacity. Not with advisors. Advisors are generally not considered troops on the ground. You can see here, this is actually a picture of a later MAG. This is actually the MAG symbol on his shoulder. Um, and generally, all they were there to do was to advise. They would often be completely unarmed, for instance. So not really troops on the ground. Um, and especially in kind of the unwritten rules of the Cold War, advisors were never considered like troops. Otherwise, you could actually consider this a war, a direct war between the U.S. and the USSR. because the USSR sent in their own advisors. Um, so so advisors don't count as actual troops. Uh, the But in 1954, that's when it's called the Fontainebleau um, Accords, um, which split up into China and made a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. Um, but the this still kept Vietnam as kind of um, a protectorate of of France, so they had to keep on fighting for a while until finally um, gaining independence with the Geneva Partition. So the Geneva Partition ended the Indochina War for a little bit, um, and that war had already taken between 400 and 800,000 dead. Um, so this was already a nasty war. And so began the South Vietnam insurgency, as people from North Vietnam tried to take over South Vietnam, or people who sympathized with the communists to the north tried to take over. Um, Now, technically, it was not openly supported by North Vietnam. They would never actually fully support um, the insurgency, and it's the insurgency that would always be fought. But they tacitly endorsed it. Um, Instead of actual North Vietnamese fighters, they had known as the Viet Minh. They had instead the Viet Cong, and this was a group known that was actually called the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. So it wasn't technically a North Vietnamese plot, but at the same time, North Vietnam certainly sent aid and all that kind of stuff over what was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is this was basically a bunch of backwoods all the way along this path right here, from North Vietnam all the way down into towards Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam. And they'd send all these goods around so that they could penetrate deep into South Vietnam rather than fighting along here at the border. And that way they'd support the insurgency. And this was a highly secretive trail. They had any number of ways of evading detection, because eventually the U.S. try to would try to stop that. Um, but the um, but the U.S. was also kind of wary about who they were supporting in the South, because in 1954, the person who was in charge, of a supposed, democratic republic, was the former emperor of Vietnam. So, not exactly a worthy president. And so in 1955, a referendum ousted the emperor in favor of a new president known as No Din Diem. And the Diem presidency would be incredibly corrupt, and was increasingly unpopular with all the U.S. advisors who generally wrote poorly of this president. And so the CIA the our Central Intelligence Agency backed an assassination plot in 1963, um, which basically meant that that South Vietnam would be in constant political turmoil for the next couple of years. So you could see, long before major troop presence was there was already a lot of U.S. meddling, and that's what we're talking about with the Camel's Nose. You have MAG in there, you have the CIA doing their kind of thing, um, and then in 1962, as this stuff becomes more and more, uh, as the insurgency becomes worse and worse, um, John F. Kennedy sends in what's called the Military Assistant Command Vietnam, or MACV, um, which would be essentially the group in charge of the Vietnam War for the rest of the war. Um, but they kind of get shoved off to the side in a couple of years, even though they technically were in charge. And this was full on intervention with U.S. Special Forces, the Green Berets, since they wear green berets even to this day. Um, and the whole idea with Green Berets is that they act as what's called a force multiplier. And essentially, they can come in, train troops, you know, and unlike advisors where they can only advise, they can actually be on the ground, fight alongside um, people, and actually participate in war. Um, and this wasn't a small effort. By 1963, there were around 20,000 troops in South Vietnam. In South Vietnam, um, so Kennedy kept on increasing the troops. Although you'll hear people think that he was somehow against bringing in more troops, that's not borne out by reality whatsoever. Um, and so they started implementing what was called the Strategic Hamlet program, where they would basically fortify a small village, gather all the villagers from around the area, and kind of train them how to fight and everything. Um, and this was kind of going good, except for the CIA had their own idea of how to fight this war beyond the special forces. Special forces and CIA often work together, but in this case, they were kind of working in opposite directions, because CIA started what was called the Phoenix program, which was a series of assassinations, uh, capture and retrieves of specific political prisoners, and that, which often ended in torture. So, CIA backed torture and assassinations and that. And while they would sometimes bring in special forces to do that, um, the they were not exactly working in tandem with this strategic Hamlet program. And so the strategic Hamlet program just fell apart, um, as the CIA kind of pushed a very much more aggressive agenda than defense, like the special forces had intended to begin with. So this kind of is what all of is going on before um, what's known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Um, so 10 months after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, a tiny little a couple tiny three North Vietnamese torpedo boats were spotted in coming after the USS Maddox, a destroyer. And these torpedo boats have the possibility of taking down a destroyer. And so they engaged him. The torpedo boats went away. Simple as that. No big deal. But then there was a second so-called battle that supposedly the North Vietnamese were coming to attack the Maddox again. turns out it was probably a false radar positive, but that didn't matter to Congress, who saw all this happening, and um, you know, uh, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, the person who had taken over for Kennedy, really pushed for a response to this, and so Congress issued on the 10th of August, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Um, this is known as the blank check because it basically allowed allowed LBJ to send as many troops as he wanted and as much funding as he needed to wage this war. Um, so the U.S. was officially fully involved in the Vietnam War, and it had gone from military advisors to special forces and now to regular forces. Um, so in dealing with this this kind of buildup, the U.S. had actually already started um, strategic bombing of the North, because the North had obviously been supporting this insurgency, even though not like officially. Um, and so the first bombing campaign had actually started in 1961, before special forces were even in there. Um, and it steadily escalated. By 1962, we were already using chemical herbicides to basically deforest the North, and make sure that they'll be perpetually in a famine. And in 1964, the U.S. even started bombing Laos, where the Ho Chi Minh Trail was. And finally, in early 1965, the U.S. officially started full-scale strategic bombing of the North, as in just carpet bombing entire swaths of land, killing thousands upon thousands of people in the process. This is this is what during World War II was called terror bombing, but now we just call it carpet bombing or strategic bombing. Um, the idea being that you're going to demoralize your enemy by making times so bad for them. Uh, turns out that doesn't really work so well when you have that well of an entrenched enemy. Um, and so, realizing what was happening, um, the Viet Cong actually tried to take an offensive before the U.S. could deploy a major amount of troops. U.S. Troops wouldn't wouldn't really start arriving until 1965. And in 1965, there were around 180,000 troops, whereas in 1964 there were only around 25,000. So you could see there was a tremendous buildup, and so the Viet Cong wanted to take advantage of that lull between the time that war is kind of declared. It's not an actual declared war, but and the troops actually arriving. So as soon as that blank check was issued, they start out on this major campaign to try to wipe out the South. But the South Vietnamese managed to hold their own to a little pocket around Saigon until the U.S. arrives in 1965. And the U.S. managed to push back a lot of this. A lot of this so far sounds a lot like Korea, right? You have this major push from the North, and the U.S. arrives, and there's a major push back. But to not repeat the mistakes of Korea. Remember, Korea was going fine until we got near the Chinese border, and then suddenly China got involved, and that turned Korea real nasty real quick. But so the U.S. didn't want to have China get involved again, and so we did not invade North Vietnam. Um, even throughout the war, um, we would never invade North Vietnam because of this fear. Though with other fears, for instance, international condemnation for invading a sovereign entity, even though they were supporting the insurgency and all that. It's a whole complicated thing. Made quite funny by the fact that we would end up invading Cambodia in 1970. So, in order to, go after the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So, we're willing to go after the Ho Chi Minh Trail and invade other countries for that, but we're not willing to invade Laos or North Vietnam. So instead, we resorted to what were called search and destroy missions. Essentially, the U.S. troops would just um, would set up bases or forward operational bases or FOBs, where they would hunker down for certain periods of time, and then would range out to search for Viet Cong. And when they run into them, they would destroy them. They would search for the enemy and kill them. This was not really a particularly good, a particularly effective policy, but this is exactly how the war would be fought all the way into the late 1960s. By 1968, there were over 500,000 troops. So this search and destroy policy is the mainstay of Vietnam, of the Vietnamese War for years, as the U.S. escalated our troop presence throughout the war. And these troops and increasingly ended up, committing atrocities and stuff along those lines. You can see here a village being burned because of possible Viet Cong presence. And this was a very common sight. We even had special attachments on our tanks for doing precisely this, burning down villages and making sure that the enemy had no place to recover. But they were a crafty sort. First of all, they could mix in with the common populace by just dressing in civilian clothing, and since they weren't an actual like army or anything, this loose association could just annoy U.S. troops rather than having big offensives. But the North Vietnamese did plan one major offensive during this war that was particularly devastating. The Tet in Vietnam is basically their New Year celebration, but it can last for like a month. To quote a movie, it's like Christmas. It's like Christmas, the 4th of July, and Easter all wrapped in one. But it's this big celebration that Vietnam does, and their initial offensive arrived during these celebrations. So the Viet Cong really pushed for this attack, and yet the U.S. was able to repel it quite easily, actually. But this was kind of seen as a clear failure of the whole search and destroy policy. The general in charge, named Westmoreland, had been actually trying to say that search and destroy was not working for over a year, and this was kind of the big show that U.S. policy in Vietnam was failing, and that turned public opinion inside the United States against the Vietnam War. So there had been an anti-war movement throughout this period, um, that it started basically as soon as the war started. Um, you can hear people like Martin Luther King saying saying the war is immoral before um, before Kennedy is even out of off, well, taken out of office, shall we say, um, before he was assassinated. Um, so you know there is some awareness of this war prior to it becoming a big thing, but after 1968, it became an especially big issue. And mind you, 1968 was an election year. So um, this came to a huge amount of push. Um, Now we'll be talking a lot more about like hippies, the counterculture, and the new left, and all that kind of stuff on Thursday. But we have to understand about why it was such a big deal as compared to like the anti-war movement we saw during Iraq, or even the anti-war movement now against like other parts of the war on terror. Um, is that there was a draft. The US had maintained a draft ever since 1940. So um we had a peacetime draft after World War II. We had a peacetime draft after Korea. But people were being drafted for this. Basically, even though most people volunteered, the draft is actually more of a recruitment tool than a means of getting more um, conscripts. Um, the the fact that you could be drafted became quite an issue. Um, and Throughout this war, there would be a total of 1.9 million draftees, and 9 million total soldiers who would actually end up fighting in Vietnam. Um, and mind you, Vietnam's not a nice war, right? You can see in the previous one, like you're trouncing around in the jungle, you're having to, burn people's villages down, stuff like that. It's not a nice war. I mean, war isn't nice generally, but this one's particularly brutal. Um, and So people became quite disillusioned with it. Another reason for the big pushback was um, mass media. The fact that um, prior to this war, in Korea, yeah, there were a lot of households um, that had television, but the ability to broadcast wasn't to broadcast all of the images of war wasn't quite there yet. But by the 60s, you have like people sending all kinds of footage back to be broadcast throughout the United States of this war. And mind you, it's not a nice war. Um, so there's this there's this animosity because of having to see what war is actually like. Then you have a huge amount of college students, and well, I'm sure some of you can speak for yourselves, but college students tend to be a bit more willing to protest, let's say that, more left leaning. And of particular importance to why there were so many students at this point in time was that right after World War II, there was what's called the baby boom, as in a bunch more people were being born because of um, everybody returning from war, hence baby boom, sometimes just shortened to boomers. Um, and these boomers are, supported the by their parents, who often have the GI Bill that can be given to their sons and daughters to go to college as well. It not only applies to the parents, but can actually apply to children if the parents haven't used it. So there's a whole lot more people in college at this point. Also, keep in mind, college was so much more affordable back then um, than it is today. Um, and the other thing with all this, um, unlike previous wars, um, media that opposed the war wasn't suppressed. It wasn't denounced. It wasn't put down by various legislation. You might remember from World War One, there was the Sedition Act that kept basically the lid on any kind of opposition. And during World War Two, it didn't really there weren't any laws to enforce. Well, there were local laws for it, but um, there was cultural backlash against anybody who opposed that war. As opposed to here, there's no suppression of stuff. We'll actually talk a little bit about one specific kind of suppression that led to the free speech movement in Berkeley, but that's on Thursday. Um, but you can see this is a whole new level of animosity towards the war, as opposed to anything else before it. Um, and then um, the people within the army started kind of being opposed to the war itself. One of the biggest organizations in terms of opposing the war was Vietnam Veterans Against the War, as in people who were actual veterans of the war who opposed it. Um, it's a great way of making sure that that you can't have conservatives labeling anyone who um, well, not, in this case, it wasn't really conservatives; it was um, social liberals, but those are not the liberals of today. Um, and these people like LBJ would label these anti-war protests as being unpatriotic and all that. But then you can't really say that when you have literal veterans leading the march. Um, and this also meant that there was, you know, a big movement against the draft itself. Bunch of people ended up moving to Canada. The around 60 to 100,000 people evaded the draft by going somewhere else, Mexico or Canada. And there were about 27 million deferments, as in people who went to college rather than join the war. And you can get a deferment for going to college if the draft is instituted. And in fact, all of these evaders would get a pardon in 1977. Of note, we've had two presidents who managed to get deferments during this war. That would be Clinton and Trump. Though Trump did it for supposed medical issues because somehow he couldn't walk. So with that growing animosity, there was, of course, what happened with the Tet Offensive. So this created what people called the credibility gap. Basically, LBJ had been selling this idea that the war was going well, that only one more year, only a few more months, only this, only that, while he steadily increased the amount of troops, and clearly it wasn't going well. So there was this gap between what LBJ was saying and what could be taken as credible. And so LBJ realized realizing that he had this credibility gap, said that he would not run again. He could have ran for a second term, but he chose not to, basically because of this credibility gap. And so the Democratic National Convention became a quite a hotspot for anti-war protests, leading to leading to the um, to a trying to break up the protests because the city of Chicago would not allow them to actually have a permit. There was recently a movie called The Trial of the Chicago Seven. I haven't seen it yet, so I can't tell you whether or not it's good, but it's about the people who were accused of inciting a riot, even though it was actually the police who came in swinging. Um, and mind you, this is kind of supercharged with news about what's known as the My Lai massacre. Um, and this is when the U.S. Army killed between 300 and 500 Vietnamese in My Lai, a village. Um, Generally, when we like burnt down villages and that kind of thing, we didn't just go around massacring people. The burning down a village was to make sure that that the Viet Cong didn't have a refuge. This was a massacre. Of course, um, something that kind of gets swept over with all of this is that massacres were actually pretty common, just not by U.S. troops. The U.S. had brought in, Australians, uh, British troops, um, New Zealanders, and most importantly, South Koreans. And the South Koreans were particularly brutal, committing dozens of major massacres throughout the time that they were there. But My Lai was the first time the U.S. really kind of showed the ugly side of the war. Um, and so um, this riot at the convention, the opposition to LBJ's and handling of the war and all that kind of stuff led to Nixon getting elected by what he called the silent majority. And what he campaigned for um, was was what he called peace with honor. So the idea was that he would end the war, but he would do so honorably, as in he would make sure that South Vietnam was capable of fighting this insurgency, um, if need be. But so he created this policy of Vietnamization once he took the presidency in 1969. Right around the same time as Woodstock, actually, if you know about that. But this Vietnamization policy was essentially the U.S. would steadily pull out troops and try to train up South Vietnamese troops to fight the insurgency without them. He also had this idea that if he just would threaten North Vietnam with nuclear war and just act as what he called a madman towards them, that they would back down from backing the Viet Cong. Well, that's not what happened, because the North Vietnamese called his bluff. They were like, basically like, you're not going to nuke us. Nice try. After all, the way they saw the war was not as this insurgency that had to be fought, but as a civil war. They thought that it was a civil war between two competing visions of the entirety of Vietnam. So with all of this going on, another strategy that he tried to take in terms of fighting the Ho Chi Minh Trail and everything was invading Cambodia. So he authorized the invasion of Cambodia, and to try to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This, of course, um, this Cambodia itself had already been in a civil war at this point, so we basically intervened on behalf of one of the opponents in the civil war. But this really was seen as an escalation of the war, completely the opposite of his whole idea of Vietnamization. So people really protested this um, to new levels, especially after a batch of protesters at Kent State um, were shot at by Michigan National Guard, um, and and 4 of them were killed. This um, you will hear in the songs for this week that you're listening to. One of the songs is Ohio, and you'll hear the term 4 dead in Ohio. That song is specifically about the Kent State shooting. And that was over this invasion of Cambodia. So Nixon's kind of dropping the ball with Vietnam as well. And then in 1971, a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, who was working for the CIA and CIA, released a batch of papers through the New York Times called the Pentagon Papers. These papers revealed that the war wasn't going well, as people clearly suspected already, and it also revealed that the U.S. was bombing Laos, which is something we said we hadn't been doing. It showed that it basically contradicted everything we'd been saying about how the war was fought, and it revealed the Phoenix program, that whole capture, assassination, and torture program by the CIA. So, this was a devastating thing, and then the U.S. finally starts dealing with North Vietnam as trying to have some sort of peace accords. But before the U.S. could start that in Paris, the North Vietnam actually launched a massive invasion of South Vietnam. So this invasion clearly showed that South Vietnam was on its last legs. In 1972, the Vietnamization had proceeded fairly effectively, and so the U.S. had pulled out a bunch of our troops by then, and had even stopped drafting in 1971. So there was this kind of relief of pressures at home, right as North Vietnam invades South Vietnam, and shows that South Vietnam is not ready to deal with peace on their own. But of course, the peace accords continue anyways, and North Vietnam stops the invasion during the peace accords, and they were signed in 1973, making the officially making South Vietnam and North Vietnam separate countries, as they had been the whole time. And the U.S. pulled out, having declared peace. And for 2 years, South Vietnam manages to just kind of limp along until in 1975, after Ho Chi Minh had actually died and everything, North Vietnam launches a full-scale invasion of South Vietnam with another spring offensive, and they managed to take Saigon. In the heat of this fight to take Saigon, a lot of U.S. A lot of people who had supported the U.S. intervention, a lot of people who, a lot of U.S. civilians and that who were still there, doing economic stuff, and a complement of Marines, about 50 of them, needed to be evacuated. But the biggest amount of people who were evacuated were South Vietnamese civilians fleeing from the possibility of Red Terror, as in communists massacring their opposition, which was pretty common in these times. So the U.S. ended up evacuating between 100 and 130,000 people from Saigon during this this offensive. And by this time, we'll get to why and that later on. But Nixon had resigned and all that due to Watergate, and Ford declared that he would not intervene to support South Vietnam, that they were on their own on this one. And so he basically declared the end of the Vietnam War 2 years after it had actually ended. So you can see this is not a good look for the U.S. And so the U.S. had to really deal with the effects of basically losing a war. Even though technically we had achieved our goals by leaving with South Vietnam still intact, not supporting them when they got invaded in 1975 basically meant that everyone saw the war as a loss. And so this led to a lot of people feeling like they'd been betrayed by the government. There's this whole idea of the spat upon veteran. You might have seen the movie Rambo, for instance. That movie includes this scene where he's complaining about having been spat upon when he came back because of the anti-war protesters and that. And that's not exactly true. That's kind of what is called a stab in the back myth. This idea that the federal government had failed veterans, and this has actually led to a lot of problems. For instance, huge amount of white supremacy in the following years. But would use this myth to drum up support in that. But there was a great deal of neglect of veterans of this war. There were about 58,000 people who were killed, 58,000 Americans who were killed, though throughout the U.S. actual occupation of South Vietnam, there was at least 1 million Vietnamese killed, bare minimum. And the whole Vietnam War from 1945 with France all the way to 1975 with the conquest of Saigon, that's around 4 million people dead overall throughout the whole thing. About 15% of U.S. veterans come back got what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, and this was portrayed in the media as them going crazy and having Vietnam flashbacks, man, and stuff like that. And because of things like the My Lai massacre, folks were often demeaned. Veterans were often demeaned as baby killers, a trope that persists to this day. So there was significant neglect of Vietnam veterans. In fact, they wouldn't get their own GI Bill until quite a bit later. The GI Bill at this point had to be re-upped for each war. The Montgomery GI Bill, as we know it today, wouldn't be created until 1983. So, well, it passed in 1983, didn't go into effect until 1984. Um, so, um, even getting veteran benefits is really difficult for these veterans, as opposed to their Korean and World War II counterparts. Um, but in 1979, they did start trying to heal by creating the memorial, as you can see here. This memorial, um, the fight to create this memorial really revealed how much um, how much of a scar Vietnam left. And in fact, the final design, which was actually part of a contest, um, was derided as being a black gash of shame. Um, if you've seen the Vietnam War Memorial, it's this kind of beautiful expression of our shame for what for was essentially a useless war. You actually go down. This is a downward path into a little V-cut shape on the national grounds, and the black stone reflect your image while you stare at the names of American dead. It's quite a powerful statement. And this also led to what some in the War Department call the Vietnam syndrome. Essentially, the U.S. would no longer be willing to commit to any kind of war. And one of the longest periods of peace we've had in our history was in the 1970s, right after this war. The U.S. wouldn't be involved in another war until 1978. So that's 5 years of peace, a very rare thing. And that war that we were involved in was Lebanon, and it just gets complicated. But the um, this this fear of another Vietnam led to our unwillingness to commit to long-term wars all the way until 2001, and we'll get to that a couple weeks from now. But instead, in 1990, this led to the idea of the Powell Doctrine. Um, Basically, the idea of, can it be a quick war? If it can be, we've got to have an exit strategy. And this was a way of dealing with the Vietnam syndrome. But this was really quite a blow to U.S. morale, and we'll talk about this a lot more when we talk about the crisis of confidence, which was basically an entire decade, the 1970s, in which the U.S. population became increasingly disillusioned with our government. And we'll see that there was a sharp turn to the right in response to all this. But you can see this has some lingering effects. So hold on a second while I turn off the screen share. There you go. So, can you describe some of those lingering effects? Anybody can unmute.
I mean, so far with this Vietnam syndrome, I mean, since Vietnam, I can't think of a very long-term war we've been involved in. I don't mean like the war on terror is like multiple wars fought, but like
Mhm.
I don't think there's been a war that's lasted many years or like more than 5 years, like since the Vietnam War because of this.
Well, Afghanistan has lasted much longer than the Vietnam War. Um, you know, the Afghanistan began in well, you could say that it began on 9/11, but U.S. involvement in the Afghan Civil War um, was in October of 2001, and we haven't left. So we're still there. Though you could say that technically we handed over majority control to the Afghans in 2014, but that still is more than a decade of warfare. Um, Actually, longer than Vietnam even at that point. And um, depending on how you count it, you could say that Afghanistan is our longest war. So we do have that, but in between Afghanistan and Vietnam, we didn't have any long term wars besides, you know, minuscule involvement in things like Lebanon, where we were there for like 3 years, and or the peacekeeping missions in various places. Um, you could argue that that after the Persian Gulf War, we technically remained in kind of a state of war between us and Iraq by maintaining no-fly zones, periodically lobbing missiles into them, and even invading a couple of times in the 90s. So it is kind of a misconception that there's no long-term wars in between it, but it depends on your definition. But you know, like when you hear the term Vietnam, what springs to mind? Protests, um, you know, jungle warfare, um, good music, um, and move the movies like Apocalypse Now, right? Um, but what does that do to our collective psyche?
I mean, aside from all those, I mean, aren't we still putting out? I mean, not us individually, but I mean, there's still a big population of veterans that are still dealing with the effects of some of the gases and stuff, like like Agent Orange and stuff like that. Isn't that something kind of that's a long lasting effect that's kind of affecting not only veterans but lots of their families as well?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, Agent Orange is one of the main defoliants that we use to talk a little bit about that whole defoliation of North Vietnam.
Yeah.
Um, and Agent Orange is one of the main ones that we used. We actually used a whole bunch of stuff. Some of it turns out to be um, not exactly legal by the Geneva Conventions. The Agent Orange is, but not well now. Probably couldn't argue that in The Hague, but at that point it would be pretty easy to argue. We've kind of discovered that Agent Oranges has this like long-term health effects, and people who were exposed to it, thousands of veterans, um, you know, had to fight for the fact that actually affected them well into the 90s, in fact.
Right.
That they would go to the VA, VA hospitals, which if you're a veteran, you have the right to go in there for any kind of service related thing, PTSD, start losing your hearing or anything along those lines. You're allowed to just go in there and make a claim. Even though you might not be part of the VA system or anything like that, just being a veteran, if it's service related, they have to treat it. But you have to prove that it's service related. And Agent Orange was one of those things that the U.S. government wasn't willing to acknowledge. Had long-term side effects. So people would say that oh, it's just because you've been smoking too much or something along those lines. They tried to dismiss it. We're seeing the same thing happening today with Afghanistan veterans and Iraq veterans who have to make claims of dealing with respiratory issues from burn pits because we burn our trash, and if whatever you have in that trash might cause later on long-term issues. and they might not creep up for a decade or two. So you can see there's a lot of things that mirror Vietnam in Afghanistan, or Iraq, or I guess Syria now too. And depending on how we react to what just happened in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, might be Iran too. Oh boy. But this legacy of kind of neglecting veterans does really show itself when talking about Agent Orange, and we're kind of repeating the same thing. There's a lot more people after the experience with Agent Orange. There's a lot more advocacy to recognize the burn pit issue this time around, at least. But like when we're talking about, the collective experience of Vietnam and how it changed the US and that, this is core to understanding its significance, right? Like we talked a little bit about how the counterculture rose up against it, the anti-war movement. We talked a little bit about Vietnam syndrome. We talked a little bit about the kind of disillusionment. So when you see that, if you saw like Vietnam War on the test, or let's say what's the importance of the My Lai massacre? And what would you say for that?
Well, it really brought a lot of mostly because it was recorded and all that. It brought a lot of public attention to the war. It horrified people that this could be happening. Like that is just to an extreme where it's like it gets so much negative public attention because no one can defend that. It's just it brings a lot of negative eyes towards what's happening.
And what's interesting is in terms of public scrutiny in that, for instance, we right now are having this major trial in Michigan of the guy who killed George Floyd. He's on trial right now. And so that brings a whole lot of public scrutiny, just as there was no, it's not Michigan, Minnesota. Getting my M states mixed up, but we just saw a shooting a couple days ago with somebody like mistaking a taser for a freaking gun. And the public scrutiny is heightened because of this trial and everything. And the same thing happened with My Lai. Suddenly the US started trying to prosecute it. They kind of threw the lieutenant who was in charge under the bus, even though it was actually kind of the whole command structure was at fault for it. And they just kind of threw one lieutenant on the bus and hoped that would get it. But no, this really challenged the whole idea that Vietnam is going well in that. And so LBJ had to basically, he didn't resign, but he said that he wouldn't run for president, which threw the Democratic Party into it was basically like throwing a hand grenade into politics. So yeah, there's this huge effect from My Lai, beyond just the people killed. It ends up affecting American history. And so, as I'm kind of alluding to with the stuff happening in Minnesota and that, what can we learn from all of this? what are the takeaways? Be sure you have to unmute yourself if you want to say anything.
One of the takeaways I get from it is that there is way more media even today, that there's even less to get away with from either side when it comes to conflicts, war, anything like that.
So, as in like the fact that everybody has cell phones now and everything, and the internet, you could just upload anything, means that public scrutiny of war is quite substantial. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, very much so.
So, how come we don't see and Afghanistan's still going? How come we don't see constant protests of that war? I mean, it seems like people have completely forgotten it by now, and yet we have something like 8,000 troops in Afghanistan right now. Although I'm going off of 2019 numbers on that, and
Do you think it has to do with
2020 was a crazy year. But even during the Iraq War, which was not as popular as the Afghanistan War. The Afghanistan War is kind of the more understandable of the two. But the Iraq War was deeply unpopular, and yet we did not see the kind of protests that we saw during Vietnam. So,
I think we didn't see the protests because we were attacked on our end, thus giving our nation that okay, go get them mentality. And
well, that
ever
makes sense
since
for
then, they've
Afghanistan, not exactly Iraq, though, right?
no, but it was the dictator with weapons of mass destruction that we were trying to police.
So yeah, you could argue that, but there's also one factor that's missing in that whole list of animosity towards war that was pretty crucial to why it was so protested back then, and that's the draft. We don't have a draft. There's no conscription. You technically everyone's a volunteer. Now, full disclosure, I actually fought that war, and I didn't exactly go willingly. I joined to pay for college, but technically I volunteered. And so that makes a lot of people less willing to protest it when people are voluntarily fighting this war. So you have a lot of similarities in terms of protests. What about the war itself? Like, what can we learn from the war itself?
I don't know about if it's, well, definitely one of the takeaways is like there's always going to be that debate.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Just we're really quiet.
How about now? Is that better?
Yep.
Okay, so what about the idea that there's got that debate of, even though you're in the middle of war, there's still thing, how far is going too far type thing, I guess. Does that make kind of any sense? I mean, we did some pretty questionable things, I mean, over there, and I think that kind of led to a lot of the backlash and kind of, leading again to the debate that we still have, again, like how far is going too far, even to win a war type. You know what I mean?
Are you talking about like, torture and assassination and massacres and that kind of thing?
Yes.
That
of civilians and like including civilians in those kind of tragedies and atrocities.
Because we haven't committed any like major massacres like My Lai in these wars, although we have bombed the crud out of civilians with all kinds of collateral damage, but um, collateral damage seems to be more acceptable, right?
Yeah.
That troops straight up just massacring 500 people is not not as good for optics as just as having accidentally killed people. Well, accidentally, the intended effect is to kill people, is just not those specific people most of the time.
Well, that's
Andrew says in text that the military has used less chemical weapons since then. In fact, the military has used none. Well, depends on what you mean by chemical weapons. I mean, for police actions, when the like National Guard gets called up to put down a riot, they'll obviously use like tear gas and that's technically a chemical weapon. In fact, that's not even allowed in war whatsoever. But defoliation is not technically chemical warfare, so that's why Agent Orange and that was allowed. Was that they were attacking plants, not people, and that differentiation is important for whether or not it is classified as a chemical weapon or not. Because otherwise, you'd be every time you put some weed killer on your lawn, you'd technically be using chemical weapons, and that doesn't make any sense. It's the fact that we were using it for war doesn't make it a chemical weapon. But the U.S. hasn't tried to use defoliation in Afghanistan the same way. There is a campaign to so the Taliban in Afghanistan often is paid by illegal poppy trading, basically the opium trade, and so the U.S. actually has a program where we will pay farmers to plant something else rather than poppies and that. And so the U.S. will then is allowed to come in and burn that field, but matches are not a chemical weapon. Same thing, it is kind of defoliation, but it's a very different thing than just spraying it on an entire country. And that's another thing that we're going to have to deal with in terms of smoke inhalation and that in years to come. But in terms of like how the war was fought, there's chemical warfare, yes, and there's also just the atrocities that were committed. But what about the actual like search and destroy, Vietnamization, and that kind of thing? Like, what can we learn from that? Oh, I just realized we've already ran out of time. I'm sorry. The idea being that these techniques of war are highly volatile, and that they can lead to escalating warfare, and something that we have to be extremely careful in terms of engaging with. We don't have any time. I'm sorry I went over. So if you have any other questions, go ahead and ask them. Otherwise, have a good day.